Welcome back. We're talking about China's war on pollution. Let's get back to our panel right now. Let's go to Huang Wei, again in Beijing. Huang Wei, the South China Morning Post newspaper reported earlier this month that ozone pollution is worsening in northern China, with traffic congestion being the major cause. And a study by Chinese researchers identified ozone as a growing health risk. How big an issue is this?
Ozone has indeed been increasing, especially for the summer period. In last summer, ozone was shooting up, and the unique dangerous element of ozone is that it's not as visible as the other pollutants such as PM2.5 or PM10, so that when people go out, they still see blue sky, even if it's a really heavy ozone pollution day. So this increases people's chances of getting exposures, even if they, because they do not conduct the protective measures. So ozone is majorly formed from the chemical reaction between oxides of nitrogen and VOCs under the sunlight. So VOC is a major pollution coming from the chemical sectors, the oil refining sectors. So there was a research of these industries last summer, and also the increasing oil consumption.
Right, so Jeff, we can see the problem is manifold in China. Where is the country moving to in terms of alternative sources of energy? We know that solar is very popular, but how does that impact, I mean, the turn to solar, would that impact China's economy in any way? What about cost?
Well, it impacts the economy beneficially in terms of its provision of jobs. I mean, at the end of the day, what China has done for solar has been motivated not by the environment, but rather by a desire for jobs, particularly in certain provinces, and by a desire to have a leadership role globally in new industries that the Chinese leadership has come to believe are going to be very important and very profitable. As that has developed, it's become possible to think of renewable energy technologies such as solar and wind of scaling up to a level that actually might have a palpably beneficial effect on the environment in China, but that's not how it started. I just want to make a point for your viewers about the distinction between the kind of pollution we're talking about here and the kind of pollution we're not talking about here. Because your viewers will have obviously heard of the phenomenon of climate change. Right. What we're talking about here is local air pollution, largely the sort of stuff that you can see, although that's obviously, as we just heard, not the case with ozone. But it is the kind of thing that causes people to recoil and to get quite angry and to demand action. Climate change is associated with greenhouse gases, which are invisible, you can't smell them, and it's a much, therefore, harder problem to solve. And I just want to make the point that China has articulated a goal of having its carbon emissions peak sometime between 2025 and 2030, which will be quite significant. But even if that happens, neither China nor the world is anywhere near on track to curb carbon emissions to the level that scientists, most of them say, would be necessary to avert dangerous consequences. And so I think it's important to clarify that while we're talking about a local air pollution win, which if it continues will be quite significant, there's another problem here which remains really, really intense. And although renewable energy is rising in China at quite significant levels, it's rising off a very small base. And I think it's really important to keep this context in mind.
Okay, that is an important distinction. Jennifer?
I just wanted to add that with the progress that we talked about at the beginning, where how the skies are getting bluer, and the comment about the ozone, it does raise a point I wanted to stress, that the Health Effects Institute just released a study saying that because of all these other pollutants that are coming up into the air in China, that we're still going to see 1.6 million people die early every year in China. In part, it's a numbers game. The Chinese people are living longer. There's a larger cohort of elderly people who are more vulnerable. And even the air quality today, while the skies are bluer, is still not meeting even the Chinese standards of air quality for a lot of these local pollutants.
Sorry, can I jump in here?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to comment on Jeffrey's point and also Jennifer's point here. There are two dimensions to this air pollution cleaning up versus climate change. Our viewers should also know that in order to clear the air locally, a lot of efforts have been gone into converting coal into liquid and into gas. These are both anti-air pollution efforts as well as a kind of a next phase of petrochemical solutions. But in the process, we have Greenpeace and others done major studies. This process, although cleaning local air, but in fact, it made a lot more CO2 into the air. That's the first point I want to emphasize to complement what's being said. The other point, globally, if we're talking about climate change and CO2 emissions, we should know, with the recent talk of a U.S.-China potential trade war, that we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of export items are produced by foreign multinational corporations in China for the purpose of exports. They, in fact, moved their production facilities to China in the past couple of decades and polluting there, emitting there, using energy there, counting all those numbers on China's head, and then, in fact, move these products back to Walmart, to the rest of the world, Canadian Tire, whatever, to be consumed by the Western countries. Yeah. So we are a part of the global CO2 emission theme, and the percentage of China's CO2 emissions is partly done by Westerners. So we need to look at the global level efforts of what China is doing is part of the global efforts. That's what I want to add on that.
Okay. Huang Wei, if we look at pollution in China in its broadest sense, I mean, we've been talking about pollution coming from contaminated air, but what about things like water in China? Tainted water, we know, in China has caused deaths. How big an issue is that? And how much of a focus is there on clean water?
Mm-hmm. So first, I want to also build up on the others' points about the climate and air pollution. So indeed, the carbon emission problem and air pollution problem are the two symptoms of the same illness, that China's energy structure is heavily dependent on coal, and its economic structure is heavily dependent on the heavy industries, the highly pollutive and energy-intensive industries. But the local air pollution problem is really what triggered the government campaign on anti-pollution, that to phase out coal and to restructure the industry. And also for water, because there are actually also action plan on water as well, but it hasn't yet gained the same the same profile as the air pollution problem, because in air pollution it's just so unique because it's visible, and no matter what kind of position you are in and what kind of jobs you're working at, you're all affected by it. But water pollution tends to be more local. But still, I think overall, the Chinese government's determination to have a better environmental protection effort is very much recognized.
Jennifer, we have these parts of China, industrial zones, where which are highly concentrated, where we have very high levels of pollution. But what about rural China? What kinds of pollution are we seeing there?
Well, I mean, that's where quite a number of dirty industries, both of air and water, have been pushed out of the east. A lot of it, some of it, even before all the pressure came on the local governments from above, some of this was from below. And in fact, I think on the water issue, I mean, I would argue that the water pollution and water shortages are probably China's biggest environmental challenge. And as they're shifting some of these polluting and heavily water-intensive industries out Western China to rural China, it's having catastrophic effects on communities that they need investment, but they aren't as politically powerful and savvy as maybe the urban areas. And so it's very disheartening to kind of look at how rural China is being polluted much more. That said, I mean, this year's China's, I believe, white paper #1 did focus on bringing up the rural economy yet again, and pollution is one of the topics. But it's tough. I mean, I think it's, while we maybe gave an A to some of the mega cities on the efforts and progress they've made on pollution, I think it's going to be quite tough in the rural areas.
Jeff, you were talking earlier on about the international effort that's needed to combat climate change internationally. But when we take the environmental pollution that we're talking about here, is there a lesson for other countries in what China is doing?
Yeah, there are a couple of lessons, I think. First of all, there's a lesson about what drives environmental change. And the lesson is that a crisis drives environmental change. And I think if you look throughout history, you see that big environmental shifts and big energy shifts are all about reactions to the kind of crises that no one had to debate. That, by the way, is very different from climate change, which a lot of people sort of have to wrap their heads around. But what happened in China is that, you know, you walk out in particularly major cities in China, and the air is gray and essentially chewable. You know, it says something in a society when a face mask becomes a fashion symbol, as has been the case in Beijing and areas, particularly large metropolitan areas in China. So one thing that this says is that it takes an absolute crisis to drive a society to react environmentally, usually. Number two, it says that the Chinese structure of government is particularly well suited to try to deal with a crisis like this. That is to say, a country with a strong central government that has a history of command and control regulation has at least a kind of structurally easier time dealing with this than other places where political control is less centralized. I guess the third point is, just to echo some of the things that have been said, that it's one thing to articulate very aggressive cleanup strategies, and it's one thing to enforce those cleanup strategies in the most visible, largest cities, and that is what has been done thus far in China. But for China to clean itself up to the kind of levels that it's aspiring to, it's going to take much more. It's going to take propagating that kind of action around the country in a much more diffuse way, and I think the jury's still out as to whether that happens. The last thing I would say is that there's a technological aspect to this, and it's really interesting to see that China itself is starting to develop some of the technologies, which then maybe end up being used elsewhere in the world, and that is a switch from what's happened in the past.
All right, and we are going to have to leave it there. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.